So there is an entire cottage industry in journalism devoted to predicting and talking about the next big thing. So the next big thing can be articles or broadcast news stories about cultural shifts, or it could be breakthroughs in medicine or finance or artificial intelligence. And of course, we all live in the epicenter of next big things. Here in Silicon Valley, our neighbors are the ones designing the next generation of autonomous vehicles and perfecting generative AI. Now, if you're like me, you read these news stories partly just to stay in the loop, and also partly because, who knows, maybe we'll spot an investment opportunity. For instance, a few years ago, I came across a new social media platform. It's called Be Real. Now, Be Real's appeal was simple: authenticity. Unlike Instagram or TikTok, where people curate and filter the best moments of their lives and post those for their friends to see and be jealous of, Be Real prompts users once a day at a random time to take a photo of whatever it is they're doing right there at that moment and then post it. No filters, no curating, no posing for a fabulous lunch on the French Riviera. Just real life. Here I am folding the laundry. But Be Real was launched back in 2020, which is ancient history in tech years, and it quickly exploded in popularity. A few years later, it sold for hundreds of millions of dollars, and that kind of potential big payday is one reason we're intrigued by the next big thing. But it's also just because we've been conditioned to expect that whatever is new will make life faster, safer, cheaper, healthier, more entertaining, more meaningful. That could even include the idea that a new breakthrough might even make us more spiritual, maybe more enlightened. It might just be human nature to aspire to something better, especially when life's hard or confusing or frightening. If we're stuck in toxic circumstances, we rightly long for an escape. If we're struggling financially or emotionally, we hope for something there to shift. If the daily tornado of headlines makes us feel like we've reached yet another level of weirdness, we yearn for a return to civility and some basic compassion for our fellow humans. Even when life's going relatively well, it's good and healthy to dream and to stretch and to grow and to hope for a better world. But our longing for the next big thing, whether it's about status or lifestyle or even peace, love, and understanding, well, it can also be a trap. It can leave us perpetually dissatisfied, always chasing, but never quite arriving. And that kind of yearning can lead us into one of two directions. We can lurch forward, chasing some imagined breakthrough that promises to fix everything, even waiting for the next election cycle to cure all of our ills. Or we can retreat, yearning for a past that, if we're honest, probably never really existed in the way that we remember it. Sometimes we can do both things at once. Right alongside our desire for the next big thing, we can also pine for the good old days when life felt less complicated, before we got all battered and bruised. One of my favorite writers and ministers is Barbara Brown Taylor, and she calls that backward-looking impulse that we all have to one degree or another, she calls it a desire to return to a mythological Garden of Eden, a place where there was nothing to hide and nothing to hide from, where nothing had ever been broken, where there were no chips or dents or scars, a place where everything was still whole and holy and pleasing to God. Plenty of us have felt that longing. I certainly have. Maybe you have too. The ache for some earlier, simpler version of life before life just got so complicated, so bruised, before life took us in directions we never asked for, we never counted on. So, not having what we feel we need in the present can move us forward towards something we've never had that'll fix everything, or so we think. And then there's the type of not having where we once did have it, but we don't have it any longer. And I'm pretty sure that second type is harder to live with, because the thing we once had, it can grow into a mythology that never really was as perfect as we can convince ourselves that it was. These days, we see that a lot whenever we have a public discussion about American history. On the one side are people who think it's healthy to acknowledge that not everything about our history is always pretty. On the other side of those who think it's unpatriotic to ever bring up racism or slavery or the killing and forced removal of native people from their land. That's because our natural tendency is to create mythologies that are rosy. If we're unhappy with the way things are now, we can always point back to what we believe was a much happier time. And it's mighty uncomfortable to have that notion of how great things used to be ever questioned. But God, speaking through the prophet Isaiah a very long time ago, calls us to step out of that kind of nostalgia. In Isaiah 65, God speaks to a people who were stuck, not because they had no future, but because they could not let go of their past. These Israelites had already returned home from exile. They were no longer captives in Babylon. They had rebuilt the temple. But let's take a moment to review the whole Babylonian exile thing. It can be confusing, but it was hugely important to ancient Israel, and the scriptural literature surrounding it had a huge influence on Christianity. We'll hear about that a lot next month as we go through Advent. It's a big reason why we ever discuss prophets like Isaiah, because those writings helped the early Christian writers hundreds of years later to develop their concepts about who Jesus was. So the exile, it happened between the year 607 BCE and 586 BCE, so about 70 years in there. The Babylonian Empire stretched into Israel, and as occupying forces often do, it imposed its will on the traditional religious and civil leadership. So those religious and civil leaders rebelled. There were actually several different times during that period when various groups of Jews were taken captive to Babylon. But the initial rebellion resulted in the Babylonian army laying siege to Jerusalem for over a year, killing many, many people and destroying the beautiful Jewish temple that had been built by King Solomon. And they took captive many thousands of Jews and just left Jerusalem in ruins. But no empire lasts forever. By 536 BCE, the Babylonian Empire had been overtaken by the Persian Empire. And the Jews that had been held in captivity and their children who'd been born in captivity were finally allowed to return to Israel and begin the process of rebuilding the city and their temple. So now, here we are where this reading takes place. They were back in their homeland. And yet, well, something was missing. Their memories, more myth than history, convinced them that the old temple that had been destroyed, Solomon's temple, had been much more magnificent than the one they were currently building. But it wasn't just the temple. The old city walls had been so much taller. The old culture had been purer, safer, and stronger. They resented the new diversity in their land, the multicultural reality of their society. People of different races and religions were now living among them. For Pete's sake, who let these people in? Israel was not such a powerful nation anymore, and they resented that loss of status. Life was more complex, and they were living off the fumes of a mythology that told them the world ought to be black and white. So they were disgruntled, outraged, and resentful, and they felt left behind and misunderstood. They yearned for a return to what they believed once was. I don't know if any of this sounds least bit familiar to us, but it was certainly on the minds of those people 2,500 years ago. I suppose, proving that human nature is relatively consistent. They wanted the next big thing to look exactly like the last big thing. But through Isaiah, God said, I am about to create new heavens and a new earth, not a reboot of the past, not a restoration of King Solomon's glory, but something truly new, a future that doesn't mirror your memories, but transcends those. Because in Scripture, God is never about going back. God is always about moving forward. The next big thing in the divine imagination is not a return to the Garden of Eden or a revival of some golden age. It's a radically new creation, a world of peace and justice and joy. A world where children live long, healthy lives and old people are honored. A world where people build houses and live in them, and where they plant vineyards and enjoy the fruits of their labor, where people who have been wolves, predators, and the people who have been lambs, the prey, will coexist. A world not of nostalgia, but a world of possibility. And the twist is the truth that God keeps whispering to us again and again. The next big thing is not a product. It's not a place. It's not a politician. It's not a platform. It's not even really a religion, because religions are human inventions. But that will have to be another sermon. No. The next big thing is us. You, me. All of us, shaped in love, gifted with breath, created to live fully, not in reverse, not in neutral, but going forward. God always has and always will be in the business of creating and recreating. A new day of creation, after all, happens every single day. We are not built to live in regret or in illusion. We're created to take some responsibility, not to whine when things don't go our way, but to roll up our sleeves and get busy making things better. We are created to hope and to act and to love. Love is hope embodied. And that's what moves us forward to the future that God envisions for us. Bill Bryson, in his wonderful book, A Short History of Nearly Everything, great book, you got to read that. He writes this: "We're awfully lucky to be here, and by we, I mean every living thing. To attain any kind of life in this universe of ours appears to be quite the achievement." He goes on to say, as humans, we are doubly lucky. We enjoy not only the privilege of existence, but also the singular ability to appreciate it, and even in a multitude of ways to make it better. It is a talent we have only barely begun to grasp. Isaiah's prophecy is God's invitation to appreciate this miraculous gift of life and to do our part to make it better, not by clinging to old stories or passively waiting for the future to arrive, but by stepping into that future together right now, because we are the ones God is creating new possibilities through. Okay, so what does that look like? It means asking in our families and in our friendships, how can I make this relationship healthier and more honest and more loving? It means asking in our church, how can we grow in creativity and in service to others? How can we stop being afraid of not having enough and start living into our collective calling to be the servant leaders in our community that God expects us to be and needs us to be? How can we share our gifts more generously and care for one another more faithfully? How can we leverage our fantastic facilities here to provide programs and events that educate, enlighten, serve, and inspire our neighbors and our community? It means asking in our daily lives, how can I be the person God made me to be? How can I use my talents and my compassion and my imagination for the good of others and the healing of creation, for the benefit of generations yet to be born? It means asking, especially in such a time as this, when our faith and our humanity compels us to speak with bravery, to act with generosity, and to demonstrate hospitality and compassion. It is to ask, how can I be the gift the world needs right now? Because in God's eyes, we already are that gift. We are the next big thing, not to make ourselves great, but to help the world where everyone can thrive, to create that world. And the really good news? We know this. God is already at work in us and through us to make that happen. The gifts that we pledge and consecrate today will help make the big, bold vision God has for us a reality.